What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Zero Hedge Podcast with me, your host, Rob Bernstein. Today, I have Daniel Batten on, who just had a piece up on Zero Hedge talking about how the IMF is trying to undermine Bitcoin and adaptation in smaller countries. So firstly, it's a pleasure to have you on, and that's a very fine shirt you got there.
Thank you. I do try and make an effort.
Yeah, I gotta step up my shirt game. I'm still on t-shirts and hats, but we're slowly getting more professional as I go.
They're good as well. I think just different people suit different styles, and I tried t-shirts and hats, and I can't pull it off anymore. I'm in my mid-50s, so pull it off for as long as you can.
There you go. I think the billionaires like your Mark Zuckerbergs and the other ones just did us poor people such a favor by dressing down and making it that you can just kind of dress like a slob and look like you work in tech.
Yeah, there's I think Jack Dorsey has really perfected that art of not just dressing down, but taking it to a next level where he looks like a homeless person. So I don't know if you can take it too much further in that direction. Now we kind of have to go back the other side of the slope.
Well, I mostly don't appreciate what those guys are doing, but the dressing like a bunch of putzes and making it easier for us to look professional, I do appreciate. So let's start with this. I read years ago Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which was a great book, and I was even thinking about it while I was reading your piece, and then you referenced it within the piece. But why don't we just start here with, if you can explain on paper what the IMF is, what it pretends to be, and in your opinion, what the IMF is actually up to.
So the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank work in concert, and it happened after the Bretton Woods Agreement. So at the end of the Second World War, the duty of the IMF was to help to rebuild war-torn Europe and also Japan. And so it had a very noble mission, actually, which was infrastructure financing at a nation-state level to help these countries which were decimated in the war to rebuild. And it achieved that aim. So it did actually achieve some really positive things. And then, like a lot of entities, once it had achieved its initial aim, it went looking for, well, where else can I deploy my resources? Where else can I do work? And that's the point at which there was an inflection. And if you start to look at not the IMF's own reports, but some independent reporting on it, what their stated intention was, which was to help be a lender of last resort, to help to empower countries, to help them to raise their GDP. That it achieved. The World Bank and the IMF, they have absolutely helped to raise the GDP of countries. But what John Perkins said, and he went round for many years as really a consultant as part of the pre-sales work for the IMF and the World Bank to show presidents of nation states why it would be in their economic advantage to take on massive amounts of debt. And what he would do is he would say, well, look, the correlations are very clear. Look at every country who takes on debt. The GDP of the country goes up. And that's undeniable. And so he was going around the world. Out of college, he was trained as an economist, believing he was doing something great. And then along the way, what he realized was that, in fact, GDP is a really lousy measure of the economic prosperity of a country, because it's really only measuring the concentration of wealth of the top 1%. So it doesn't measure the health, it doesn't measure the prosperity of the 99% of the country at all. And if we look at what's happened to wealth inequality, what's happened to poverty levels, what's happened to social services, what's happened to the economic engine of a lot of these countries, it's actually gone down. And at the same time, there's a lot of really good quality information that shows that the net benefactor of these loans has been the West, that for every dollar of aid that goes to these so-called developing nations, that there's about $3 or $4 of aid that flows the other direction in the form of World Bank and IMF repayments. And so typically what will happen is you have the World Bank will go in and they'll lend some money for a big infrastructure project, maybe an airport, maybe a dam, maybe new roads. And then there'll be these clauses where if they default on that loan, then the IMF will often come in and they'll help to restructure that loan. So they kind of will police that loan, and they come in when a country is already typically in some sort of trouble of meeting its debt servicing obligations. And this is where John Perkins really opened my eyes, because whenever you have any lender-debtor agreement, you always have clauses about, well, what recourses, what remedies can the lender take if the debtor defaults or isn't able to meet their obligations. And the list is pretty extractive. The IMF had the ability to impose terms where that nation state they can basically dictate terms to them and say, well, you have to change your policies. You have to sell off your government assets. You have to privatize sewage. You have to privatize water. You have to privatize different utilities, for example. And some would say, well, that's a good thing. It should be happening anyway, but that's not the point. Then they'll also say, well, we'd like to have an American military base here. Well, we'd like to extract oil and copper and lithium and cobalt at much more favorable terms. We think that you should devalue your currency, which again has huge benefits to being able to extract materials from that country at a very low rate. We'd like you to support us at the UN on these key issues when it comes to Cuba or some other nation state who the US is not favorably disposed towards. And whilst on paper the IMF is an organization which encompasses over 190 different countries, the key point is this: in order to lend to any nation state and to dictate terms, you need an 85% supermajority of votes. Okay, guess how much of the voting share the US owns? 16.5. So the US has effective veto rights on every single IMF loan that is ever written. So it's become an instrument of US global geopolitical influence. It's become a way to basically dictate terms which are favorable to US corporations. A lot of the money doesn't even go to the nation. It'll go to the corporations which are doing the big infrastructure projects, around 85% of the money. And then whatever money stays in the country, often it doesn't go to the people, but it'll go to the head of state, which often is a dictator, because dictators are actually great to do business with. They're very easy. You don't have to get broad approval from your national Congress or whoever it is. The dictator says, yes, I want that loan, and they'll take it. And sometimes it gets embezzled, and sometimes it gets spent. Sometimes a lot of it goes on bribes or corruption. So very little of that money actually benefits the people, and a lot of the projects that are built are often overbuilt, such as dams we've seen around the world, which are built with way more capacity than was ever needed or could ever be delivered to people. So the legacy of the World Bank and the IMF working in concert is well documented, and as I say, outside their own marketing material, has been generally quite heavily criticised across the board, including by those people who have worked, such as John Perkins, as an advocate for World Bank and IMF loans.
It really is, and excuse my language here, but it's just straight up mafia shit of cut the guy a loan so that he can afford your services, but cut it in a way that you hope that he actually defaults so that you can then, it's like right out of Goodfellas.
Well, it actually is. And I know that through talking to John, because he would say, look, he would be talking to people within the World Bank, within the IMF. He said, look, if we can find people who will default on these loans, then that's where our leverage really kicks in, because that's where we can really start to exert our influence and start to extract more of the minerals, more of the resources of this country. So absolutely. Look, I work in the area of infrastructure financing. I have an infrastructure financing company that does infrastructure financing of Bitcoin mining rigs for landfills. And when you work in that field, you understand how powerful an instrument debt is. And there, absolutely, within Wall Street, there are a lot of companies who will specifically go out looking for debtors who are going to default, because you'll actually do better if they default, because you can exercise any number of remedies than if they don't. So there are good and bad actors within the debt financing world. This is not conspiracy theory. This is just what happens, because debt is such a powerful instrument. And when it's a powerful instrument at a nation state level, then yes, you can extract vast quantities of wealth and resources from one nation to others. and to corporations. Often it's not just to nations. It's not going like it's going back to another nation state. It's going to corporations, which often aren't even based in the US anymore.
All right, so we can accept that IMF is not looking out for the nice poor people in these countries that they're doing business. So now let's take a look at, and this was really the core of your article, but why the IMF is looking to undermine Bitcoin usage in these countries and some of the efforts it's taken to do so.
Well, Bitcoin really breaks up the party, which has already started to get broken up a little bit. So there's two big competitors that the IMF has. It's really enjoyed, along with the World Bank, and they work in concert. They're not competitive. They do different stages of the debt financing, but they work very much collaboratively. So that monopoly has already been broken up a little bit by China coming in and offering another lending option to a number of different countries, including Pakistan. And if you look at a lot of the loan agreements that have been written in Latin America and in Africa of late, a lot of them have actually been to China and not to the World Bank as much. And the reason for that is China has a great story, because they can say, well, why would you take a loan from the IMF? It basically represents US geopolitical instruments. Look at the US over the last 40 years. Have they really grown their economy substantially? And China says, well, look at us. Look at what we've done. We've brought 250 million people out of poverty. Isn't that what you want to do? We have the playbook. We can show you how to do that. And we're not going to insist that we extract minerals. We're not going to insist on a military base on our country. So we're going to offer much more soft terms. We're not going to insist that you support us at the UN, or maybe on Tibet. But apart from that, not so much. So they don't have to be, they can still be aggressive lenders, but by being less aggressive, they're a preferred alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. And so already that monopoly has become a duopoly. And then Bitcoin comes in and it really threatens to turn
Just
over
on the topic of China, is that basically the Silk Road project, or is this something else that you're referring to?
Well, it's basically China looking to copy the IMF and the World Bank playbook by lending large amounts of infrastructure financing capital to countries throughout Africa and throughout Latin America. And why does it lend the money? Well, same reasons the US has, and it's geopolitical influence. So now you have, and if you look more recently, whilst the US has been spending a lot of the last couple of decades printing a lot of money basically to finance wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China has been very strategically lending a lot of money to countries in the developing world to shore up its geopolitical influence. So this is starting to play out. So you've got a very interesting theater of geopolitics starting to play out already. And then Bitcoin is like this rogue character from the side that enters in and could threaten both of their little party. Now, so why does the IMF not like Bitcoin? Well, very simple. If you look at what's happened to Bhutan, Bhutan was within 3 months of needing IMF assistance. It had an existing World Bank loan, and its currency reserves had reached a stage where it wouldn't be able to pay for its imports. And part of the reason for that was that it lost a lot of tourist dollars through COVID, and it was very dependent on the tourist industry. So it was in some real strife. At the same time, someone had the smart idea to say, we've got a lot of spare hydro resource. Why don't we use that to do Bitcoin mining? Because otherwise they would have had to either just flow it over the side of the dam and wasted it, or they would have sold it to India for a fraction of what they could have recouped if they were to use it for Bitcoin mining. So they chose to do that instead. And what happened was fascinating, because they were able to earn so much, basically getting power at zero marginal cost, converting it into digital gold. And they earned so much that now they have 40% of their entire GDP comes from their Bitcoin mining. They've been able to put up the wages of their government workers by 65%. I mean, that's outrageous. Just imagine you work for the government in the US and you come in to work one day and they say, hey, we didn't tell you this, but we've been mining Bitcoin and we're putting up your wages for 65%. Never happens. It's insane, but they were able to do that. More importantly, though, they've been able to build up a strategic Bitcoin reserve without having to purchase it, and it meant they didn't have to take on an IMF loan. The IMF lost a customer because of Bitcoin. That's not good. Now, the last thing the IMF wants is then Pakistan. who's a neighboring country, well, not too far away from Bhutan, and then maybe India, and then maybe Kazakhstan, other countries in the region, and then people like Ethiopia going, hang on a minute, we can take this playbook. We can do the same thing. We can start to build up our own Bitcoin reserves, and that's going to build up our sovereignty. So we're not going to be beholding to the IMF for debt conditions. It's a much more attractive proposition. And so now you've got these 4 countries. You've got the Central African Republic, you've got Argentina, you've got El Salvador, and now you've got Pakistan, all of whom said, yep, we want to have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. We want to have a Bitcoin strategy at a nation state level. And in 4 out of 4 cases, the IMF has said, no, you don't.
So I want to dig in and ask a couple of questions. So in all of these countries, when they were trying to make a strategic Bitcoin reserve, were they looking to purchase Bitcoin, or were they looking to essentially...
Different strategies for each country. So in El Salvador's case, it was mainly through purchasing and continues to be through purchase with only a little bit of Bitcoin mining. In Bhutan's case, complete opposite, 0 purchasing, because they knew that wouldn't fly. For the same reasons the US are not going to do it. They want to do it in a tax neutral way. But they had all these vast supplies and oversupply of renewable energy. So they said, we're going to use that. In Argentina, they would have been quite happy to purchase it. There's also hydro energy they could use. There's also other forms of energy they could use. Central African Republic will never know exactly what they had intended. But the key point is there's different ways you can do it. You can do it through mining it, you can do it through purchasing, or you can do it through a combination. And we've got a model of each. We've got a model of, if you purchase it, El Salvador, that's worked very well. El Salvador have got a 123% return to date of unrealized gains through purchasing Bitcoin. Bhutan worked out very well. 40% of GDP, put up government salaries, built a new airport, still acquiring Bitcoin, didn't need an IMF loan, greater sovereignty. Rest of the world's watching because they mined Bitcoin. So both strategies can work.
So you might not have an answer to this, but you just kind of piqued my interest. How much low-hanging fruit renewable energy is available across the globe that for some reason, it just seems like an arbitrage opportunity? How come people haven't figured out, hey, there's abundant electricity, there's a river right there, no one's, put a wheel in it that's going to move around and give me free electricity so that I can mine? How is there still just so much low-hanging fruit opportunity of Bitcoin mining?
Well, the engineers have figured it out. The renewable energy generators have figured it out. The utilities have figured it out. The Bitcoin miners have figured it out. Governments haven't figured it out. And in some cases, they just haven't shown any interest. So, for example, in the UK right now, famous for having the highest amount of their biggest export right now is millionaires. They're exporting them at a faster rate than any other country in the world. They're leaving in droves because of government policy. And that same government has completely missed the ball on Bitcoin. They have vast swathes of renewable energy in the form of wind energy in Scotland. Most people don't live in Scotland. They live in the Midlands, or they live in the south of England within the UK. So that energy has to be transported, but because they have an aging grid, like many countries in the world, it can't all be transported. So a lot of that wind energy just gets wasted. In fact, more than £1 billion of energy gets wasted every single year. So about 1.2 billion US dollars every year through squandered wind energy. It should all be used to be mining Bitcoin. Same thing in the south of France, same thing in Portugal, same thing in Darwin, in Northern Territory in Australia, same thing in Greece, same thing in West Texas, East Texas. The only difference is in West Texas, they've realized this. They had a government who embraced Bitcoin. They had a utility that embraced Bitcoin, and now they've got the biggest concentration of Bitcoin mining in the world. It's stabilized their grid. It's helped them to proliferate renewable energy. It's kept electricity prices low when they spiked at other places in the US. It meant they didn't have to get $18 billion of gas peaker plants to stabilize the grid. So it's been a dream. But because of prejudice, because of lack of education, because of gaslighting of Bitcoin, saying it was bad for the environment for 4 years, people just in government haven't caught up in a lot of these countries. So they are starting to catch up. They have caught up in some countries in the world, but there's a lot, particularly in Europe, who are just behind the 8 ball.
I mean, it's such a shocking mismanagement. Because if I understand you correctly, essentially with some of these renewable energies, they produce too much energy on specific days that can't be stored. And so you might as well just use that to run a computer and mine Bitcoin, and then you can capture some of the dollar value of what's just otherwise wasted electricity. Is that basically the idea?
It's as simple as that. The only nuance is that if it's hydro, then it's not just wasted on a daily basis. It's more on a seasonal basis, where a country will tend to have a rainy season where you have too much energy, and then they'll have a season where it's not so rainy, where you won't have enough. And so, yes, it is an arbitrage opportunity. So other people have said, well, we don't need Bitcoin mining. We can do pumped hydro. We can use green hydrogen. We can use batteries. And these are all part of the solution fundamentally. But Bitcoin mining has something very unique about it, and that is that utility doesn't have to purchase it. It can partner with a commercial organization, so the cost is lower. It's much more modular. It's much more flexible, much cheaper than buying batteries, and it has the ability to, for example, if you have 92 hours in the north of Germany, which has a peak wind event, and you're trying to deploy all that power to the south of Germany where all the industry is, and you can't transport it through the grids. Well, what use is having batteries, which can only give you a roughly 4-hour discharge time? And at the time they discharge, well, what happens if prices are negative? That's not in anyone's economic interests. Whereas Bitcoin mining, you can curtail that load for way longer, which means that you can curtail it, but when there's a surplus, you can fire it up and you can utilize it, you can monetize that energy. So it helps you to stabilize at both ends. When there's an oversupply of demand, then it tapers off, it load balances. And when there's an undersupply and prices would otherwise go negative, you can bring it online, you can soak up that energy, which makes those renewable energy generators more profitable, which means they can deploy more renewable energy. And that's actually how we get a green transition without spiking energy prices and without causing grid instability. You cannot do it at speed without Bitcoin mining.
All right, so that was my ADD. You just kind of piqued my interest on the logistics of the capitalizing on renewable energies. But to go back to what we were talking about, you were essentially explaining that one of the reasons why the IMF doesn't want countries coming up with strategic Bitcoin reserves is because it allows them to find funding without basically taking on loans. Were there any other issues that the IMF, basically looks at countries adopting Bitcoin and doesn't like it? Are there any other reasons why it gets involved and tries to make sure that they don't make that pivot?
There's a few different reasons. One is if you're a country which has been sanctioned, Bitcoin is a way where you can get around sanctions. So Iran is using Bitcoin to get around sanctions. You can trade oil for Bitcoin, for example. Right? Venezuela is using it to get around sanctions right now. Russia is looking at how to use Bitcoin to get around sanctions. So it weakens geopolitical leverage. That's another reason. Another reason is that if you have Bitcoin, you can actually get money into the country much more easily without remittance payments, right? So in El Salvador, for example, almost 1/4 of the entire GDP comes from remittance payments. That's people sending money back home. Now, about 6% of that is in fees, which go to these organizations such as Western Union. Now, you might say, well, why does the IMF not like that? Well, very simple. If you have more money coming into the country, well, that's going to mean that nation state doesn't have to hold as much in their foreign exchange reserves. And if they don't have to hold as much in their foreign exchange reserves, then that means they don't need an IMF loan as soon. So you start to look into all these different areas, and the more you look into it, the more you think, you know what? There's actually about 5 major reasons why the IMF really opposes Bitcoin. But I think the major reason is that they just lose relevance. In a world which is, if you really project into the future, in a world which is on a Bitcoin standard, there is no need for the IMF. Where you have a currency where countries have sovereignty, where there's no threat of currency being devalued 40% overnight, which happens, or 50% overnight, which happens, suddenly the IMF doesn't have relevance anymore. It starts to lose its customer base to give loans to, and it starts to lose that geopolitical leverage that it has. So there's threats right across the board. So a lot of the reasons they oppose Bitcoin is the same as the reasons that a central bank would oppose Bitcoin, which is that loss of relevance and that loss of centralized power.
All right. So, I do want to talk about how it seems like almost particularly on the topic of Bitcoin, the IMF does not seem to be in lockstep with Donald Trump, who I just think has essentially invested into the asset, so he likes it. But before we get into that, what was the proof of, because I think within the article, I think you had 5 different countries and what the IMF did to exert pressure so that they would not, essentially the country, make moves to start switching over to Bitcoin. So what were the examples that you had of, and how the IMF did it to essentially basically pressure governments not to be utilizing Bitcoin?
Well, the first thing that happens is that you'll get these newspaper headlines where the IMF says, the IMF is concerned about your Bitcoin strategy. And the reasons cited will be picked from about 3 or 4 different reasons. Number one, we're concerned that it'll detract foreign investment. Okay. We're concerned that it will destabilize the economy. We're concerned that it'll weaken your central bank's ability to influence monetary policy. Or if they're looking to do Bitcoin mining, we're concerned that it'll destabilize the grid. Now, we know that these arguments are nonsense. There's peer-reviewed research and continual case studies that show that Bitcoin mining does not strain the grid. It actually increases the resilience of the grid. If we look at what happened in El Salvador, did it cause them to lose foreign investment? No, they got more of it. They got more tourist dollars. They got more foreign investment. They got more people looking to settle in El Salvador. It increased to a whole range of not just Bitcoiners, but people who care about technology worldwide started to think, hey, El Salvador is a place that I might want to visit now. Now, obviously, their Bitcoin policy was only part of that. There was also the work they had to do to take a whole lot of criminals off the streets. But the Bitcoin policy was a key part about attracting foreign investment. So the IMF's concerns, what they said would happen and what actually happened were opposite. Now, you can only do that so many times. You can only cry wolf so many times and say, hey, these terrible things are going to happen if a country adopts Bitcoin, only for the opposite to happen before people start to lose complete faith in why you're fear-mongering in the first place. So whether in the Central African Republic, for example, same thing. We're very concerned about this. El Salvador, $1.4 billion IMF loan. In the loan agreement with the IMF, so this was interesting because El Salvador at the time when they adopted Bitcoin did not have an IMF loan. So the IMF had no leverage. That was one of the reasons that El Salvador was able to adopt it. That was the reason that Bhutan was able to adopt it. There was no IMF loan leverage. But the minute El Salvador wanted an IMF loan, then suddenly the two were in negotiation. And it's been interesting what happens because it hasn't been a full victory to the IMF because El Salvador probably had some other options at its disposal as well as the IMF. But to give you an idea of how much they opposed Bitcoin, the word Bitcoin was written into the loan agreement 221 times. There were 6 different conditions related to Bitcoin that they wanted El Salvador to reverse. When the IMF wanted to, or rather when Argentina wanted to take on a $45 billion loan, in terms of your question, what does the IMF do? Well, basically, they use the fact that someone wants a loan as leverage to put in whatever terms they want. And they were very explicit. There was nothing hidden here. It was covered widely in the news media that they said, we will give you a $45 billion loan over time if you form an anti-crypto policy, the IMF's words.
So, no, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
Yes. So again, this is not conjecture. The IMF has been very explicit. We're only going to lend if these countries reverse this dangerous Bitcoin adoption policy that we are very concerned will destabilize the country or destabilize its grids. That has been their strategy, very overt and repeated.
So it's interesting to me because it just basically seems like people that have their hands in the cash game, the US dollar game, and all the processing, they just want to keep everyone on the dollar. And Trump's making the same play because he just threatened BRICS essentially that if you guys are even having this conversation, I'm putting an additional 10% tariff on you. And, you don't very often, I think, see the U.S. government admit to the fact that, the dollar's got to be the reserve currency because that means that we can continue to steal people's wealth through inflation. I don't know that he actually said that secondary part, but that's mainly why it's important.
Yeah.
What?
Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's basically the United States government's in a business, and it's called the U.S. dollar currency, and getting as many people to use it as possible so that there's continuous dollar demand so that we can continue to run our debt, and then basically have people finance the debt, and then also be able to distribute the inflation as far and wide as we can. And that's basically the product of the United States government is the U.S. dollar. And so what's interesting is that the Bitcoin comes along and it essentially threatens that. And you would think, all right, if you've got the, basically the largest and most powerful entity on all of planet Earth, and their core product is the US dollar, and this other thing's going to challenge it, you would assume that it would do everything it could to shut it down. In my opinion, that's why we took out Gaddafi. He wanted to move over to gold. I think we're in the business of forcing people to use US dollars, and you actually hear Donald Trump saying it directly with BRICS now of, hey, if you guys are going to threaten us in any capacity, the dollar's really important to us. That's in our self-interest. So don't make any moves here. It's interesting with crypto, it almost seems like Donald Trump maybe doesn't get that it's such a risk to the dollar, or it was part of his winning coalition was winning over basically the crypto bros and saying, hey, I'm not going to come for your asset. / I think he's made some personal investments that in the crypto space, not necessarily specifically Bitcoin, but I know that RFK's is big on Bitcoin. So I think there's people within the administration that's big on Bitcoin. So I guess what's interesting to me is that there seems to be a divergence in policy between the IMF and at least Donald Trump at the moment, of Donald Trump seemingly at the moment being pro-Bitcoin and creating a more favorable environment for it, at least channeling that government's not going to try and legislate it away, versus the IMF, which I guess is trying to keep it from propping up or growing organically and creating more demand in foreign countries.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. And what's happening in the US is mirroring what's starting to happen across the world, where you're starting to see much more nuance in how nation states regard Bitcoin. So, for example, in Russia, they are very prohibitive with their regulations with Bitcoin mining companies, very centrally controlled. They ban it from certain regions. They encourage it in others. They're trying to discourage private citizens from owning Bitcoin, whilst at the same time wanting to build up their own Bitcoin strategic reserve through Bitcoin mining revenue and wanting to use Bitcoin as a means to circumvent trade restrictions. In China right now, at a nation state level, they are, I would say, I would be very surprised if they don't already have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. I have reason to believe they're probably mining at a nation state level as well and adding to that reserve, whilst at the same and allowing vast swathes of Bitcoin mining to occur in the country. In fact, probably around 20% of hash rate. Why? Because it solves problems. Where industry has migrated out of different industries, out of different regions, you can bring Bitcoin mining in because it stabilizes grids. So it solves a lot of problems. They absolutely do not want their private citizens using it, though. Because it's not something you can monitor and surveil. So they're absolutely discouraging and trying to do everything they can to ban Bitcoin so they can control capital flight, so they can continue surveillance. In fact, they're launching their own CBDC so they can get even better at surveilling private citizens, whilst at the same time utilizing it where it suits them. So what's happening in the US, I think, is very similar in that Donald Trump was opportunistic, embraced Bitcoin because he could see that it was a large and vocal, and often cases, single issue voter group, and that proved to be very politically shrewd. It was probably a big part of why he won the election. Some would say it was the part, and there's an argument statistically for saying that was true. That was a winning move. So very shrewd. I think Donald Trump's a trader. He saw it as a winning trade and probably saw that, look, we can do the same thing. We can use Bitcoin where it's advantageous to us. We can use stable coins where it's advantageous to us to accelerate US dollar hegemony, in fact. But we just have to make sure that it doesn't undermine us in other areas. So a future which Donald Trump might want to embrace and a lot of other people might be, we're happy with it to be a store of value. In fact, that can enhance our geopolitical interests, particularly if we can win and we can dominate and we can get a better war chest of Bitcoin than any other nation. And maybe they will do the as Michael Saylor says, the evil genius strategy, which is to dump gold and sell Bitcoin, therefore undermine their geopolitical enemies' strategic reserves in gold at the same time as bolstering Bitcoin. So that has a lot of geopolitical advantages to Bitcoin. Where it doesn't have a geopolitical advantage is if Bitcoin becomes money. And a lot of the policies you're seeing are not encouraging Bitcoin to become money. They're encouraging it to become a store of value. So I think you're going to see around the world that, and I can't predict what is going to happen. I don't think anyone can. Alex Gladstein has a very appealing thesis, which could well be right, that a lot of the companies that are embracing Bitcoin as a store of value, they don't realize it, but you can't stop Bitcoin. And if you embrace it as a store of value, it makes it more powerful. And if it becomes more powerful, it's more likely to become money. It's a Trojan horse strategy. Could be correct. And we don't know because we've never run this before. We don't have a simulation we can point to that tells us what will happen. So we're living this. And of course, in the Bitcoin community, our greatest hope is it'll become not only a store of value, but also a medium of exchange. That was the original vision. But there are certainly a lot of other people who would be happy for it to be used only as a store of value, but not as a medium of exchange, because that would undermine US dollar hegemony.
So all of this is so interesting to me. I read, I always pronounce names wrong, so I apologize ahead of time, but I've read most of Safadon Moose's books, and every now and again, I remember, oh yeah, he has a podcast, and I listen to it, and it's great. I'm like, why don't I listen to all of these? But I've heard him kind of describe, and I don't know that he's used this example, but that, currency is a little bit like Highlander, where there can only be one, and that essentially as one becomes more powerful, it is a bit of a zero-sum game. And so it's fascinating because if government pitches it as a store of value, and particularly if they start to buy the asset, then at least it props up the value that even if it remains kind of volatile, even though over this last year it hasn't been, where we haven't really seen any crashes like we did, I think, when it went like from 80 back down to 30, and then you start being reluctant, hey, do I really want to keep my net worth in this, or can I actually transact in this as currency? Or if you're a smaller country, you start getting more nervous about putting everything into it. But if government steps in and starts buying the assets so that, there's almost like a price floor level that it's not going to go under, you kind of really do open up the door for it to be more of a currency or more of just an item that people see as it will never go down in value. So I might as well, it almost becomes, is it Moore's law or Say's law of the bad currency chases out the good currency? Because then Bitcoin almost becomes more of the currency you want to hold while you're just spending, the fiat currency because it loses its value. And so you kind of have the good currency chasing out the bad currency. So I'm curious how government can really interact with the asset at all and adopt it and use it without, giving it more legitimacy and basically, building it up so that it takes over. I kind of buy into that Trojan horse argument that you put out.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think that you're right. I think that ultimately, whilst for maybe 10 years you can get away with using it where it suits you and not using it where it doesn't, ultimately anyone who uses it is giving more power, more legitimacy, more user adoption to Bitcoin. And if you look at what's happened around the world, for every country that's banned Bitcoin or banned Bitcoin mining, there's been 4 that have unbanned it. So the direction is certainly going. I think there was initial reflexive reaction where countries such as China just kind of, we're going to ban it outright because we don't want capital flight. That was a real reason. Stating environmental concerns was probably that much, but I think
I don't think that's China's concern.
Well, they do have some because they do have their own, but it was a small part of the overall equation, and they didn't want coal plants using it, Bitcoin mining. They wanted that for baseload electricity. So what they've done is they've migrated to another way of doing it, but definitely capital flight was a major concern for them. These governments think, that they can use it where it suits them, and to start with, it will. But as you say, over time, if you take a long-term view, like 10 years, 20 years, everyone who uses the asset, whether it's as a store of value, whether it's a way of overcoming sanctions, no matter what it is, they're giving more legitimacy to the technology. They're increasing adoption. And every time an enemy uses Bitcoin, then that's another person who just through game theory has to start using it as well. So, for example, China may not have wanted to use Bitcoin, but now that the US has a strategic reserve on the table, they have no choice. They're going to have their own one as well as a hedge against Bitcoin succeeding. And then you start to see that play out at a hedge fund level, at a pension fund level, at a sovereign wealth fund level, where people start saying, hang on, and this is what Michael Saylor has talked about, which is that Bitcoin will start to suck the monetary premium out of other assets, because ultimately it's a store of value, and it's a better store of value than a lot of other assets, such as real estate, for example, or such as gold. And so as people start to realize that, and the money's not going to come out of nowhere. Sometimes it will. If you're creating, if it's Bitcoin bonds, it will be printed into existence. But a lot of the time it'll be existing investor money, which goes and says, well, I'm going to put into Bitcoin instead of gold. I'm going to put into Bitcoin instead of real estate. Or I'm going to only put half as much into real estate and this into Bitcoin. So if you've got a lot of sovereign wealth funds or a lot of pension funds around the world who have assets, and what assets they have gold, they have bonds, they have real estate, they have stocks. Right? These are all things which the monetary premium could go down if Bitcoin really succeeds. So now they're in a position, they actually have no choice. They have to own Bitcoin as a hedge against Bitcoin succeeding. So now we're in the scenario where to not own Bitcoin is more risk exposure than to own it. And again, as other sovereign funds start to realize this, then you start to get game theory really starting to play out.
All right, so I'll hit you with one last question before I do. An opportunity, if there's anything that you were looking to plug, you can plug your Twitter or wherever else people can follow you and read your work.
If they want to read more about what I'm doing, Twitter's the best place, at DS Batten.
Excellent. And I will link that right into the episode description. As for me, I've got my other podcast, the Run Your Mouth Podcast, and I do tour as a comedian. You can find all my dates at porchtour.com, where I bring my show to the people, and I do it right from people's backyards. And before we get to the last question, I do want to take a second and thank our sponsor, My Patriot Supply. We're talking right now about electricity and all the ways that you can mine Bitcoin. And that's why I want to tell you, for all you people out there that like being able to live off the grid, you don't want to rely on the electricity grid. It always goes out at the worst possible time. Well, I've got the cure, and that is the Grid Doctor 3300, which you can get at My Patriot Supply. You use mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. Not only are you going to get the Grid Doctor 3300, they're going to throw in 2 waterproof 200-watt solar panels completely free. That's an $894 value. And I want to let you guys know, these aren't cheap plastic panels either. They're super durable, waterproof, built to last through storms, heat, and who knows what else. So if you want to be prepared for the next time the electricity goes out, you want to have a off-the-grid generator that's going to let you keep your fridge on, let you get the AC going, allow you to continue to live in comfort and not have to rely on the government's electricity grid. Once again, you go to mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. That's mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. Let's get back into the episode. All right, so my last question for you is, you did say there, and I'm curious for some more details on this, that the United States government is basically looking to have the best of both worlds, where they're, have Bitcoin as a store of value, but they're also making moves for it to not be used as currency. What are the specific moves that they've made to prevent, Bitcoin being more of a currency and less of just a store of value?
But I think in the US's case, it's not so much they've taken moves to prevent it being a currency. It's more just, if you look at the priorities, the priority has been on the Genius Act, on the Stablecoin Act, right? So it's just providing a means where now you have a stablecoin tethered to the US dollar, which potentially gives a huge amount of value and legitimacy to the US dollar. So they're looking to perpetuate the US dollar. So it's more that they're looking at crypto more broadly, and they're saying, where does this support US dollar hegemony? Stablecoins, that's good. Let's use them. And you've seen from the ECB, the European Central Bank, they're now worried, and they're now trying to throw FUD at stablecoins. So they're kind of a bit split focused now. They've been trying to throw FUD at Bitcoin and say how terrible that is. Now they're having to pivot and attack stablecoins as well, because that's suddenly on the table as something that could perpetuate the existence of the US dollar. So they don't even have to attack Bitcoin as a form of money. And in fact, I think that would be dangerous, because they're now so heavily... Some people say that MAGA and the Republicans have taken over Bitcoin. That's wrong. Bitcoin's actually taken over, MAGA has taken over the Republicans. It's now infiltrated. The Trojan horse is there. So they have so many pro-Bitcoin people now within that whole administration that they don't really have the option anymore of trying to say, well, we're going to promote it here and we're going to attack it here. They have to be more careful and just do things which might have the consequence of not encouraging it as money, whilst encouraging policies which will give more status to the US dollar. Russia, on the other hand, China, they can be much more overt and they can just attack it and take moves that will discourage it actively, which will discourage private citizens from being able to hold it. US doesn't have really that advantage, at least not the current administration. Maybe the Democrats will come in and try to do that, but I think that would be political suicide if they did.
There you go. Hey, this was a fascinating episode. I appreciate you taking the time, but before we close it out, if there was anything you thought we missed or anything else that you wanted to clarify, if not, I definitely picked your brain and got all the insight and information that I was looking for.
Yeah, I think I just want to plug the book of John Perkins. He's become a good friend of mine. I met him for the first time this year. He wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and it's a first-hand account of exactly what the IMF have gone around the world doing. I always heard about it and I thought, well, that's probably true. But after meeting him, talking with him, having a fireside chat with him at the Bitcoin conference and staying in touch afterwards, I now know that that's exactly what's going on. And it's just opened my eyes. And I think knowing that, he's also a very compassionate person where he doesn't get into blame. He just sees, hey, this is going on. Now what can we do about it? And I just want to say that I'm really glad we have Bitcoin in the world, because now countries have an alternative to this debt extraction that they've endured for centuries, and at least for decades in the case of the IMF, but the extractive policies in the form of colonization for many years before that. So Bitcoin's going to be great for the world, and a lot of the countries that are going to benefit first will be some of the poorest, which I think is fantastic.
And on that note, I'm an ADD lunatic, and I haven't read all that many books in my life. Confessions of an Economic Hitman. I don't know why I came across it, but I did maybe 10 years ago, and I read that thing in about 10 days and loved every word of it. So it's definitely an easy and worthwhile read.
Yep. Awesome.
All right.
I agree.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time, and we'll do it again down the road.
Been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.